Thank you for this kind introduction, Father Thomas, and thank you to Father Gain and to all those involved in arranging this conference. Punishment and forgiveness both presuppose guilt. You cannot be forgiven if there is nothing to be forgiven for, and it seems clearly wrong to punish the innocent. In this talk, I will focus on the guilt that, according to traditional views, is intrinsic to original sin, and in virtue of which original sin is punishable and forgiven through baptism. A good place to start in approaching this topic is the Catholic Magisterium's pronouncement about original guilt. In 1140, the Synod of Sens, let's see now. That's correct, I think. No. The Synod of Sens condemned Pierre Abelard's claim that, quote, "From Adam we have not contracted guilt, but only punishment." In its decree on original sin, the Council of Trent says the following, quote, "If anyone denies that the guilt of original sin is remitted by the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ given in baptism, let him be anathema," unquote. Trent also repeats the claim of the Synod of Carthage in 418 that little children who have not yet committed any actual sins are truly baptized for the remission of sins. It is hard to see how this can be true unless little children are in some sense bearers of guilt. The notion of original guilt is, however, one of the most controversial aspects of the Catholic doctrine of original sin. In his famous study, The Ideas of the Fall and Original Sin, the Anglican scholar N.P. Williams flatly states that the notion of original guilt is, quote-unquote, intellectually indefensible. In what follows, I will argue otherwise and suggest that this notion is both defensible and, in fact, indispensable. My presentation consists of 3 parts. I first give a brief overview of modern views on original sin, and I identify a number of ideal types. Against the background of this overview, I then argue that all construals of original sin that erase guilt from the picture have to pay a hefty price for this. I also argue that theories that attempt to retain the idea of original guilt but deny a historical fall entail an absurdity. In the second part of the talk, I then present St. Thomas Aquinas' explanation of original guilt and suggest that it can be appropriated in a contemporary context, although it has one important weakness. In the third and main part, I present a constructive proposal about how this weakness can be fixed. Let us start by making a distinction between construals of original sin that include a historical fall and those that do not. The traditional Catholic position, of course, as well as that of the magisterial Reformation, is that there was a historical fall and that this fall somehow resulted in guilt being ascribed to all humans. If we, on the other hand, accept the historical fall but reject the claim that it generated guilt in Adam's descendants, what we get is basically the position of many contemporary Eastern Orthodox thinkers, as well as some Eastern Church Fathers. Callistus Ware, for example, writes, "For the Orthodox tradition, then, Adam's original sin affects the human race in its entirety. It results not only in sickness and physical death, but in moral weakness and paralysis. But does it imply an inherited guilt? Here, orthodoxy is more guarded. Original sin is not to be interpreted in juridical or quasi-biological terms, as if it were some physical taint or guilt," unquote. A problem with saying that the fall affected the human race in its entirety, while at the same time denying that Adam's descendants inherit any guilt, is that this strongly suggests that God punishes the innocent. Ware more or less admits that this is the case, as he writes, "Why, we ask, should the entire human race suffer because of Adam's fall? Why should all be punished because of one man's sin? The answer is that human beings made in the image of the Trinitarian God are interdependent and co-inherent. Even though we are not in the strict sense guilty of the sins of others, yet we are somehow always involved," unquote. The last statement here is ambiguous. If the involvement that he talks about does not entail any guilt, it's hard to see how it could in any way justify a punishment. And this problem is not solved by saying that all humans are in fact guilty in virtue of their own personal sins, and therefore deserve death as a punishment. Infants have no personal sins, but they still die. Now, some Orthodox theologians try to get around the problem of God's punishing innocent people by simply rejecting the language of punishment. As Petru Mihail Prutenow writes, quote, Orthodox theology has always confessed that death is a natural consequence of sin and not a divine punishment for sin. This does not seem to be generally true, however. Another Orthodox theologian, John Meyendorff, writes that, quote, death, which is the wages of sin for Adam, is also the punishment applied to those who, like him, sin. And here again, we must remind our Orthodox brothers and sisters that many humans never actually sin, but all nevertheless die. Besides the fact that the language of punishment is deeply rooted in the tradition, the issue whether God justly permits all to die on account of Adam's sin is not solved merely by avoiding the language of punishment. In the absence of a doctrine of original guilt, the sense of injustice is hard to shake off. And this, I contend, is a significant cost that Orthodox views that include a traditional fall story have to carry. So let us now move on to consider some modern accounts of original sin that do not include a historical fall. Here there are, very broadly speaking, three types of theories or models that together seem to exhaust the logical possibilities, or at least the promising-looking ones. The first type of theory posits that original sin is roughly the same as being born into a sinful world. The second type says that original sin is a congenital disposition of human beings of some kind, in virtue of which they will inevitably commit personal actual sins if they reach mature age. The third model then identifies original sin with the universality of actual sin. And in all these three categories, there are theories that endorse original guilt and those that deny it. I will now briefly illustrate the three models and their subdivisions by examples, and then argue that they all carry a great cost. While Friedrich Schleiermacher is usually regarded as the father of the first model, more sophisticated versions of it are arguably presented by Piet Schonenberg and the later Karl Rahner. Schonenberg understands original sin as the condition of being situated in a world alienated from God. As a free person, he writes, I cannot be deprived of my freedom by the free decisions of others, but they may place me in a situation which may determine me inwardly even in my freedom, unquote. Rahner, in a similar vein, conceives original sin as, quote, a universal, permanent, and ineradicable co-determination of the situation of every individual's freedom by guilt, unquote. By guilt, Rahner here means the guilt of others, whose previous actions shape the situation in which I exercise my freedom. Neither Rahner nor Schonenberg believe that guilt can accrue to a person except as a result of her own decisions or actions. The second model, sorry, I think I went too fast. Yeah, that's the second. The second model conceives original sin in terms of a congenital disposition to commit actual sins. I here use disposition in a very wide sense with reference to any constitutive or congenital, essential or accidental feature of human beings that will incline them to sin. For Reinhold Niebuhr, for example, actual sins are the inevitable results of the tension between our freedom and our finitude. And Paul Tillich, in a similar vein, claims that existential estrangement is a necessary consequence of the transition from essence to existence, which in turn is a universal quality of finite being, as he puts it. In the human being, this necessary transition takes the form of a transition from what Tillich calls dreaming innocence to actualization and guilt. Tillich writes, in every individual act, the estranged or fallen character of being actualizes itself. Every ethical decision is an act both of individual freedom and of universal destiny, unquote. While neither Niebuhr nor Tillich ascribe guilt to people before they have actually exercised their freedom, there is another recent version of the second model that does endorse original guilt. This is Daniel Hauck's new Thomist view of original sin. Hauck argues that original sin is the lack of sanctifying grace in the human being, and this lack is in itself sinful and involves guilt, even though humans may have existed in this state from the beginning. The reason why the lack of grace is sinful is that humans are called to deifying communion with God, which requires grace. Hauck writes, God can create the creature without immediately bestowing the principle of deification, called to grace but not yet in grace. This would be to create the creature in original sin. Original guilt, then, on Hauck's conception, is constituted by God's judgment on the human being's state of lacking grace. This condemnation applies to the newborn infants too, about which Hauck writes, quote, they are condemned insofar as God sees that they will perish and be justly excluded from his presence forever if they do not come to love Jesus Christ. Unquote. The third and final model is best exemplified by Karl Barth. Barth rejects any notion of a hereditary sin that has come to man by propagation, as he puts it. Instead, he understands original sin, ursynde, as, quote, the sin of every man, the corruption which he brings on himself, unquote. Adam was simply the first sinner and functions in the Bible as the symbol for every person. We all resemble him by the fact that we all sin. Barth does not attempt to anchor the universality of human sin in some congenital disposition or ontological constitution that makes sin inevitable. Instead, he seems to hold that we are all sinners because God regards us as such when he views us apart from Christ or in Adam. Original guilt, therefore, is a result of the divine imputation of sin, together with the fact that we all actually sin. Okay, after these examples of three types of theories that deny or at least do not essentially rely on a historical fall, let us look at the costs that each of these models carries. The first model, according to which original sin is birthed into a sinful world, entails that Christ had original sin since he was born into a sinful world. Since this is an unacceptable conclusion, we simply cannot hold that original sin, with or without guilt, is constituted merely by a person's situatedness in a social context determined by previous sins. There must at least be something more to original sin and guilt. Can the second model come to the rescue here? According to the second model, original sin is some kind of intrinsic disposition for sin that all persons have from birth, and that is not the result of some previous sin, such as a historical fall. Some of the proponents of this model hold that the position of the sin-inclining disposition entails guilt, while others reject the notion of original guilt. And both these versions, I argue, come with great costs. Suppose that the first version is correct, that all human beings, including the first ones, come into the world guilty in virtue of being born with a certain disposition or a certain ontological constitution. Then it follows that guilt could exist in a world where nobody has ever done anything wrong. In fact, as soon as God creates a human being, there would be guilt in the world prior to any actual sin. And this seems to me patently absurd. However, as we have seen, Daniel Hauck is prepared to bite the bullet and admit that God might have created all of us in a state of original sin that includes original guilt, albeit in a very attenuated sense. So let us suppose instead that other representatives of the second general model are right, and that the possession of the congenital disposition that constitutes original sin on this view does not itself make us guilty in any sense. According to this view, then, we all have a disposition or constitution that inevitably will cause us to sin, and we are in no way culpable for having this disposition or constitution. And the problem I see with this view is that a disposition of this kind would constitute a strongly mitigating factor that will significantly reduce our culpability for actual sins, as Ian McFarland has pointed out. This means that due to original sin, we are less culpable for the sins we actually commit than we would otherwise have been. In my view, this consequence seems to militate against the very notion of original sin, and accepting it is therefore a high price to pay, I would argue. The third model, finally, identifies original sin with the universality of actual sin. This model contains or comes with two significant costs. First, if taken strictly, it entails the self-contradictory consequence that sin is not universal after all, because a great part of humanity has never actually sinned. For example, deceased infants and abortion victims. From a Western standpoint, at least, this is unacceptable. Second, the view leaves the ubiquity of actual sin unexplained. Why is it the case that almost all humans with the use of reason are actual sinners? The answer that Barth hints at, that all are sinners in virtue of a divine imputation of sin, makes the problem worse. If it's God's imputation that makes us sinners even before we actually sin, then it seems that it is God rather than we who is responsible for the fact that we are sinners. If, on the other hand, God imputes sin to all of us because he foresees that all will actually sin, then the problem of infants and abortion victims returns. Since they never actually sin, God cannot impute sin to them on the basis of his foreknowledge. So, to sum up, I have argued that considerable costs are attached to denying original guilt, whether we assume a historical fall or not. I have also argued that theories of original sin that include original guilt but deny a historical fall entail the absurd claim that guilt can exist in a world where nobody has ever done anything wrong. In light of these problems and costs, it seems worthwhile to investigate whether there is a reasonable construal of original sin that includes original guilt and posits a historical fall. I will now suggest that Aquinas' account of original sin provides a good foundation for a contemporary construal of this kind. And I will begin by briefly summarizing Aquinas' account and then present my own constructive extension of it. According to Aquinas, original sin is the privation of original justice, which is a state of rectitude that, at least according to the Dominicans' later thought, includes sanctifying grace. When Adam is deprived of original justice as a result of his sin, his lower powers cease to be harmoniously ordered by reason towards a higher end, and instead pursue their own ends, which are lower mutable goods. This inordinate state is called concupiscence, which Aquinas describes as the material element of original sin, while the privation of original justice is the formal element. Now, according to Aquinas, quote, the first sin of the first man is transmitted to his descendants by way of origin, unquote. Since sin logically includes guilt for Aquinas, and since guilt is, quote, essentially something voluntary, unquote, the question arises as to how guilt could be transmitted from Adam to his descendants. Aquinas' first move in answering this question is to argue that all human beings constitute a kind of community in virtue of their having a common nature. Adam is the first possessor of this nature and therefore the principle from which the whole community, all instances of human nature, will subsequently be derived by biological generation. Now, when human nature only existed in one instance, in Adam, God bestowed on it the supernatural gift of original justice. This gift was not given to Adam as to a single individual, but, quote, as to a principle of all human nature, so that from him, by way of origin, it would be transmitted to his descendants, as Aquinas writes. When Adam sinned, he lost the gift of original justice on account of human nature as a whole, and as a result, he handed over human nature stripped of this gift to later generations. The defect that the absence of original justice constitutes is called original sin, which is a sin of nature rather than a personal sin. Now, Aquinas admits that if we consider Adam's descendants as mere individuals, no guilt can be ascribed to them in virtue of the fact that they have received human nature with an accompanying lack or defect, since our personal wills have nothing to do with us receiving human nature in this condition. However, if Adam's descendants instead are considered as members of corporate humanity, or the whole of human nature, as Aquinas puts it, then guilt can analogically be ascribed to each one of us in our capacity as bearers of human nature, whose principal and first mover is Adam. Aquinas writes, "The disorder which is in this man born of Adam is voluntary, not by his own will, but by the will of his first parent, who, by the movement of generation, moves all who originate from him." Unquote. Aquinas compares this with the way in which we can ascribe guilt to the hand of a murderer, provided that we consider the hand as a part of the whole person, and moreover as a part that is being moved by the person's will, which is the first mover of all the parts of his body. And he presents this analogy both in the Summa Theologiae and in De Malo, and it seems to contain the core of his explanation of original guilt. In order to appropriate Aquinas' account in a contemporary context, there are of course many issues that would need to be addressed. In the full paper on which this presentation is based, I argue that Aquinas' model is compatible with the polygenist account of the origins of humanity. Instead of conceiving Adam as a single individual, we can simply say that Adam signifies that form in which humanity existed at the beginning of its own history, as Karl Rahner puts it, whether it was as a single individual, a couple, or a larger group. Rahner and many others have suggested ways in which a historical fall can be conceived given a polygynist scenario, and there are also contemporary defenses of a modified form of monogenesis, as we heard from Father Marius yesterday. Moreover, if we, by the transmission of original sin from Adam to his descendants, simply mean that Adam is causally responsible for the fact that we have original sin, I do not see any problem with the notion of transmission either. Here, however, I will have to bracket all these issues and focus exclusively on original guilt. With respect to this topic, I believe that Aquinas' account is open to the following objection, which is based on his own analogy about the murderer and his hand. While it may seem reasonable to ascribe guilt to the hand by which a murderer kills, it seems much less reasonable to ascribe guilt to some part of the murderer's body that was not causally involved in the act of murder, such as, for example, his vocal cords. The vocal cords can, like the hand, potentially be moved by the murderer's will, but if he committed his act in total silence, then the vocal cords were not actually moved by the will in such a way that they causally contributed to the crime. This makes it somewhat strange to say that the vocal cords are guilty even in an analogical sense. Now, similarly, while it's true that Adam can be said to move his descendants by generating them, this kind of movement does not make them causally involved in his act of sin, like the murderer's hand is causally involved in his act. On Aquinas' account, instead, it can seem like Adam commits his sinful act by himself, and then he transmits the result of this act, namely human nature deprived of original justice, to his descendants by the movement of generation. However, in order for the ascription of guilt to Adam's descendants to be fully justified, even in an analogical sense, what seems to be needed, in my view, is a tighter connection between them, the descendants, and Adam's act of sin. We need, in other words, some account of how we can be said to participate in Adam's act and not merely in the social body that derives from him. I know, of course, that some interpreters of Aquinas deny that he has a realist view of original sin, according to which we all sin in Adam in some sense. However, I take this interpretation to be questionable. Aquinas explicitly says that, quote, "the sin of the first man is as it were the common sin of all." It is this aspect of Aquinas' teaching on original sin that I will attempt to develop further in order to strengthen his explanation of original guilt. The point of departure for my proposal is the fact that human sins are causally interconnected, as Schleiermacher and his followers point out. The previous sins of other people creates circumstances in which I am more likely to sin, and my sins in turn contribute to circumstances that trigger more sins, and so on. Every human sin is hence a link in a causal network or process by which sin is propagated throughout the human community. A suitable metaphor for this network is a tree that grows branches in many directions. In order for a tree of this kind to come into existence, there must of course be a first sin, a sin that plants the tree, so to speak, or that constitutes its root. Let us call this the sin of Adam. And no disrespect here to Eve in this context. Unlike all other sins, Adam's sin does not grow out of any previous sins. Now, who is morally responsible for planting the tree of sin? Adam is obviously responsible since he commits the first sin. However, if only Adam had sinned and everybody else had remained sinless, there would not have been any causal process whereby sin gives birth to sin. In that case, Adam's sin would not have constituted the root of a whole tree of sin, but remained in splendid isolation. This means that all of us who actively participate in the spreading of sin by sinning contribute retrospectively to making Adam's sin into what it is, the triggering cause of a cascade of sins, we might say. However, we cannot identify original sin and its attending guilt with the contribution that Adam's descendants make to the actual growth of the tree of sin, the causal process whereby sin spreads. There are many people who have never actually sinned, but who still have original sin according to Catholic doctrine, such as persons who die in the womb or in infancy. As we previously saw, one problem with some modern theologies is that they reduce original sin to the ubiquity of actual sin in the world. But this construal then excludes a significant part of humanity from having to be redeemed from sin. There is a sense, however, in which all human beings, whether they reach the age of reason or not, contribute to the flourishing of the tree of sin. In order to explain what this contribution consists in, I must now introduce a modal concept that analytic philosophers refer to as robustness across possible worlds. Something is robust across possible worlds if it is such that it would persist in a wide variety of possible scenarios. Suppose, for example, that I love a woman and that I'm disposed to continue to love her even if she would get sick, lose her looks, start to behave annoyingly, or come what may. Then my love for her is very robust across possible worlds. On the other hand, if even a slight change in her appearance would cause me to fall out of love, then my love lacks robustness. It should be noted that robustness across possible worlds is a real property. To say that a person's love, for example, is robust is to say something about the actual character of his or her love here and now, even though robustness essentially depends on what a person would do in certain non-actual scenarios. Robustness, moreover, admits of degrees, and the degree of robustness that a certain phenomenon has depends on what proportion of all possible worlds it persists in. Besides this notion of robustness across possible worlds, my argument also depends on the following premise, which I will call Proposition 1. All human persons, except the Blessed Virgin Mary, sin in the actual world or in some nearby possible world. By a nearby possible world, I mean a world that is rather similar to the actual world. For example, in a nearby possible world, I'm not sitting here, but in Umeå. It is only in a very distant possible world, however, that I can fly merely by flapping my arms. What makes Proposition 1 true is the fact, presuming here that it is a fact, that all human persons receive a human nature stripped of original justice from Adam. In virtue of this privation, all human persons who reach the age of reason in the actual world will actually sin, unless they receive some special privilege of grace. It is furthermore true of all persons who do not reach the age of reason in the actual world that they would have sinned if they had reached this age in the absence of some special gift of grace. Christ, of course, is not a human but a divine person, so proposition 1 does not apply to him. People like John the Baptist, who was sanctified in the womb, would presumably have sinned if he had not been sanctified. So it's true of him as well that he would sin in nearby possible worlds. Concerning the Blessed Virgin, it can be argued that any possible world in which God does not preserve her from sin by a special privilege of grace is very distant from the actual world, so that she is an exception to proposition 1. The reason why God would not allow her to sin in any nearby possible world is that she is God's mother. Now, if it is true that all human persons except Mary sin in some nearby possible world, then it follows that all human persons contribute to making the causal process whereby sin spreads in the world more robust. This process, which I've called the tree of sin, is more robust to the extent that it is insensitive to contingencies and is able to continue with full force in a wide variety of possible circumstances or scenarios. In order to see how we all contribute to the robustness of the tree of sin, let us imagine that the following proposition, which is actually false, were true. Proposition 2. All persons who have died in infancy in the actual world would have remained without actual sin if they had reached the age of reason. It follows from this proposition, if it were true, that there are many nearby possible worlds in which many persons who have reached the age of reason do not sin at all, namely those persons who in the actual world have died as infants, but who survive to adulthood in some nearby possible worlds. In such nearby worlds, the tree of sin would not be able to grow to the same size it has in the actual world, because many people would not participate at all in the spreading of sin in those worlds. They would instead function as brakes on this process. The more people of this kind there are in a certain world, the harder it gets for the tree of sin to extend its branches, so to speak. Now, if proposition 2 had been true, it would have followed that the process whereby sin spreads in the world would not be very robust, since it would have run into serious roadblocks in many nearby possible worlds. Conversely, if proposition 1 is true, then sin spreads through a very robust process, since this proposition says that every human person actively contributes to the spreading of sin by sinning in some nearby possible worlds. This means that it does not matter for the advancement of this process who reaches the age of reason or not, as long as sufficiently many persons reach this age and are in a position to sin. In other words, the fact that all human persons would sin in some nearby possible world ensures that sin can spread effectively, irrespective of which particular persons happen to make up the adult human population. Against the background of this reasoning, it's now possible for us to conclude that since proposition 1 is in fact true, all human persons except Mary contribute to making the tree of sin more robust in virtue of the fact that we all would sin in some nearby possible worlds. And this goes for stillborn infants as well. While they do not contribute to the actual spreading of sin, they still contribute to the robustness of the process whereby sin spreads. And this account equips us to explain how all descendants of Adam, except Christ and Mary, can be said to participate in Adam's first sin in such a way that guilt might be analogically ascribed to them. By sinning, Adam strips human nature of original justice and plants a robust causal tree of sin. What makes the tree robust is the fact that human nature from now on lacks original justice, which means that all who receive this nature from Adam are disposed to sin either in the actual world or in nearby possible worlds. The robustness of the tree of sin is, in other words, a function of the proneness to sin that henceforth characterize all human beings in the absence of gifts of grace. This means that every human being contributes merely by receiving human nature from Adam to making the causal tree of sin more robust than it would have been without their existence. Now, if we all contribute to making the tree of sin more robust, then we can also be said to contribute retrospectively to making Adam's sin more serious than it would have been without our existence. Because of us, this sin now constitutes the planting of a robust rather than a more fragile tree of sin. Even persons who die in infancy contribute to making this the case, since their reception of human nature from Adam guarantees that they would have sinned if they had reached the age of reason. According to the present account, then, we all participate in Adam's first sin, not through what we actually do, but in virtue of what we would freely do in certain possible worlds as a result of receiving a defective human nature from Adam. It's worth emphasizing freely here because the fact that every human person sins in some nearby possible world does not entail that we somehow sin by necessity. Okay, so let's take a step back and consider my proposal in relation to Aquinas' model of original sin. According to this model, all humans are in a sense one corporate body in virtue of having the same nature, and Adam plays a pivotal role in this body since he was given the gift of original justice on behalf of the whole of human nature and was supposed to pass it on to all humans as he passed on human nature. Because he, in this very capacity, lost the gift through sin, his guilt can in an analogical sense be ascribed to all who receive human nature from him on account of their unity with him. That's Aquinas' story. What my proposal adds to this story is the insight that our relationship to Adam cannot be fully captured in merely passive terms. Besides receiving human nature from him, we are also related to him as persons who retrospectively determine the very nature of his sin by the way we are disposed to act in various possible worlds. The relation between us and Adam are hence, the relations between us and Adam are hence in an important sense reciprocal. He gives us a defective human nature, and in return we constitute him as the planter of a robust causal tree of sin. Okay, a possible objection against my proposal would be this. How can we be held responsible for the contribution we make to the robustness of the tree of sin if we make this contribution merely in virtue of receiving a defective nature from Adam? Is it not Adam alone then who is to blame for the fact that we are disposed in such a way that the tree of sin can flourish in all nearby possible worlds? This objection misses the point of my proposal, which is not intended to replace Aquinas' account, but to supplement and strengthen it. According to Aquinas, Adam is the first mover whose sinful act brings ruin to the whole human race. My proposal does not deny Adam this crucial role. However, the problem I saw with Aquinas' account was that he fails to explain how Adam as first mover can move us in such a way that we become participants in his very act of sin. Recall the analogy of the murderer whose will moves his hand to kill, thereby implicating the hand in the very act that generates guilt. What I have argued is that Adam's transmission of a defective human nature to us can, in a corresponding way, draw us into his very act of sin. This is because the disposition that Adam transmits to us gives his first sin a power that it would not otherwise have, namely the power to cause more sin through a process that is robust across a wide range of possible scenarios or worlds. This proposal draws on an intuition that I think underlies the social or situational construal of original sin, namely the insight that external and serendipitous circumstances often determine whether somebody actually sins in a certain way or not. As the saying has it, there but for the grace of God go I. If we take this insight seriously, we realize that the moral status of people is not only determined by what they actually do, but also by what they would do if things were different in certain respect. The framework of possible worlds that I have utilized here is, I would argue, congenial for capturing this dimension of the moral landscape, so to speak. In conclusion, I have suggested a way of tying Adam's descendants more closely to Adam's act of sin in such a way that it seems at least more reasonable to say that we participate in this act in a certain sense. I don't know if this is sufficient for making the idea of original guilt acceptable in a contemporary theological context, but I think that the model I presented at least strengthens somewhat the plausibility of the traditional notion of original guilt to some extent, keeping in mind, of course, that this is only guilt in an analogous sense of the term. Of course, my proposal depends on the plausibility of Aquinas' claim that the human race constitutes a kind of body or community, and that Adam, whether he is conceived as a single individual or an initial group of humans, plays a pivotal role for this body in virtue of receiving original justice on its behalf. None of these latter ideas are inherently problematic, however, in my view. So I therefore conclude that it may very well be the case that we are all born guilty. Thank you.